Thank you. Great to be here. So I'm going to start with what I think is one of the most unfortunate quotes of the 20th century. It was actually written in the New York Times Magazine in 1970 by Milton Friedman, very famous economist, one of the most influential economists around business and finance of his time. And the quote is this. It says, "There is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits." Massively influential, not just article that he wrote in the New York Times, but also concept that has pervaded business ever since. Right? And many of the problems that I think we face today in business, and by virtue of that in the world, is this mental model, this cramped, impoverished mental model of the possibilities of business. And I think business is far better than this. The opportunities that business has is one of the most important, most scalable mechanisms by which to advance social change. We believe this passionately. And the only way in which we're going to be able to address the biggest challenges of our times is, I think, through business, addressing massive joblessness, clean energy, improved healthcare. And so what we're excited about is we see the wind is at our backs in this idea of transforming business from this perspective of exclusive focus on profit maximization and shareholder value, right, to a stakeholder perspective and a much broader vision for the possibilities of business. And I think in particular, if there's any industry in the world that has the best chance at pioneering the movement to use business in service of social impact, it is absolutely the technology sector. So we know this very well ourselves because we confronted it head on when we started the organization in 2006. And I had the idea at the time, and still persists today, the mission of the organization is to empower people to create the change they want to see in the world. And I had the very same mental model because of my economics background in university as Milton Friedman. And because I saw business as in service of profits and nonprofits in service in many ways of fixing and cleaning up the problems of business, that we were going to be a nonprofit. And so that's what I did in 2006. We incorporated as a nonprofit. But I immediately faced significant challenges because the vision of the organization is the only way in which we're going to be successful is to empower 1 billion people around the world to participate in daily activities around the change they want to see. And if you want that kind of scale and the kind of resources required, it wasn't, we thought, possible in a nonprofit vehicle, much more likely to advance our mission through the vehicle of a company. We looked much more, wanted to, like Google than like the Red Cross. And so we made this transition. We incorporated as a company. And it was a surprise to a lot of people, in particular because of the .org, which speaks to the mission of the organization and not our tax status. But it was a hugely pivotal point in the history of our company. We made the decision that we cared less about legal vehicle and more about the intention and mission of the organization. But as odd as it might have seemed then, right, since then there's been this dramatic rise in organizations that are using business as a vehicle for social change. And in the future, this is not going to seem strange at all. And the reason for that is, I think, two incredibly important historic trends that are underlying the world today that are going to drive forward incentives for businesses to focus on social impact. The first of these is empowered consumers. It used to be the case that businesses could largely work in almost shrouded secrecy in the decisions they made and the impact those decisions had on a lot of their business. So your supply chain, the way workers were treated outside the US, the degradation of the environment that it might have resulted, even customer policies and fine print. And even in situations in which consumers knew about this, were aware about it, it wasn't either enough consumers or the ability for them to organize together to have impact around those policies was incredibly limited. But we live in a very different world, when both those things are transformed. We live in a much more radically transparent, and because of that, accountable world for business. Any business person now sitting behind a boardroom knows that almost every decision they make and the impact of every single policy they have will eventually be known to the public. And not only that, but the customers they have and the public surrounding them can rapidly organize and hold that company accountable, demand a public response, justifying what they've done. And that is a huge, huge shift. And I want to go through a few examples we've seen recently that illustrate the possibilities when we have that transformation of transparency and real accountability. So the first example we saw at scale this a few years ago was around the company Bank of America. So As a reminder, in Bank of America, this is the context almost of the bailouts of banks in the US. So they get bailed out in part by the American public and then contribute with a number of other banks with a new law to make it difficult to switch your own bank. And then after making it difficult to switch your bank, added a $5 unexpected fee to use your own bank card every month. There's a lot of consternation amongst consumers and a lot of activist groups, but there wasn't an immediate effective response until this 22-year-old part-time nanny, Molly Catchpool, had 2 jobs just at a university, starts a petition calling on Bank of America to serve its customers as was promised when she signed up. And the reaction is she got 300,000 people to join her from across the country. She became a permanent fixture across daytime television. She mobilizes people outside of Bank of America. She cuts her credit card up in front of them, in front of all these cameras. She helps to get thousands of people to pull their money out of Bank of America. And after a month of campaigning, this 22-year-old part-time nanny helps to get the biggest consumer bank in America to rescind the $5 fee, as does every other major national bank after. Everyone is going to follow Bank of America, and everyone ended it because of Molly and the movement behind her and the transparency that was unprecedented. A lot of people at this time asked us a few things. One, is this an anomaly? And the second, does this mean there's going to be a petition all the time? And so a month afterward, Verizon announces they're going to implement their own fee, $2 to pay your own bill online, even though it was actually better for the environment. It was cheaper because they could easily do this with a locked-in consumer base. And Molly starts another petition, gets over 100,000 people, and within 24 hours, Verizon announces they're going to pull the fee. And in reaction to more questions about whether there are going to be more of these petitions around fees, my response is probably not so many, because banks and other large institutions won't be so boneheaded as to add fees in clear, conspicuous ways against the interest of their own consumer, because the cost of doing so now is greater than ever before. And what's happened in response to Molly's campaign is thousands of consumer campaigns in a very similar vein. One of the other campaigns that happened in response was a great illustration of this transformation of business now having to think about a broad stakeholder perspective. It was around Callie Howick. So Callie is a mother of 2, and she had these 2 daughters, 23 and 25, who in 2004, were driving and rented a car from Enterprise Rent-A-Car. And it was a PT Cruiser, and what they had not known is the car was recalled by the manufacturer 3 months before. And they also didn't know that Enterprise was part of a lobby of transportation companies that lobbied Congress to get a loophole to make it actually legal for them not to return recalled cars because it was more expensive, clearly dangerous, but in their interest and totally opaque to consumers. And that PT Cruiser caught on fire per the concern of the recall. They hit a semi, and they died. And Callie fought that for 7 years in civil court, and she finally won in 2011. And she won the civil court case, but the law hadn't changed, wasn't able to mobilize enough people. What happened in response to that is she finds out about campaigns like Molly's, and she starts a petition, gets over 100,000 people within 24 hours. She's going to be on the Today Show. Today Show calls Enterprise for comments. Enterprise immediately turns around 180 degrees, and after a decade of lobbying for and investing in this special interest policy, they willingly force themselves to change. They work with Callie, and after about a year subsequent to that, a new law was passed in the name of her 2 daughters in defense of this, requiring rental-car companies to return recalled cars. Amazing illustration of a company of good people in Enterprise in a bad system of opacity who, because of economic self-interest and thinking of this themselves as purely a mechanism for profit maximization, clearly undermined not only the interest of their own consumers, but the lives of their own consumers. And one other I'll mention, and we see this happen all the time, the incredible power of young people to pierce this veil in corporations and call on them to be their best selves. This is a 4th grade class. They call themselves the Green Team. And the Green Team is out of Sun Valley, California, and they found out that they loved Crayola pens, but Crayola didn't have a recycling program and had hundreds of millions of plastic cartridges that were thrown away and not recycled every year. And so they do what seems natural to them is they start a petition on Change.org asking for Crayola to recycle the pens. Seems simple to them. And they get 80,000 people to join. And Crayola ignores them. But there's another company that makes No. 2 pencils that sees this green team, is totally inspired, thinks it's amazing, reaches out to them, has a press conference announcing that they're going to implement their own recycling program because they think it's such an amazing idea. And so what does Crayola do? 2 months later, they change the policy and they implement their own recycling program, shamed by this #2 pencil company and 4th graders in California. An incredible illustration of how businesses that used to have their brands largely defined by paid advertising, paid marketing, and has had all these policies that were largely obscure to most people, have a radically transparent environment where they cannot hide. And increasingly, your customers are defining the brand that you have, and insofar as the brand you have drives the business you have, which is almost the case in every consumer products business, you have to listen to your consumers, and they're going to drive the future of your business. And so the first major trend we see that we think is incredibly powerful is this trend of empowered consumers and radical transparency and accountability. I think it's also worth noting that we get a lot of comments on these small campaigns about, well, does this really matter? It's an individual case where Crayola is recycling a program, or it's a $5 fee, or it's a single policy and a transportation bill inside of Congress. Well, what's exciting about this is for every single campaign you see in the media, there are thousands more campaigns that are having impact in small contexts, shifting incentives so that when people are sitting behind a boardroom making decisions, they know there's a new force at bay that they have to deal with. The second major trend that we see that is incredibly powerful in giving companies the incentive to be their best selves, to be social good organizations, is empowered employees. My favorite example of this is I was giving a talk to the incoming freshman class at Stanford a year ago. And at the end of the talk, I get a young woman asks a question at the very back of the hall, and she says, I've had an amazing 2 days at this admit weekend, and it's amazing to see how many of the kids I'm going to be going to school with care about social change, but I have a concern. Are you worried that in the future, not enough people are going to want to work normal jobs because everyone's going to want to work on social change? And in some sense, I thought that was kind of silly and an indication of naivete. But in quite another, she's a part of a generation of people who want to deeply feel like whatever they do, they're making an impact. And I think the future of business is going to require, if you want to recruit and retain the best employees and engage and motivate them, having a sense of deep purpose and deep impact, whatever you do, is going to be absolutely essential. And we see this happen all the time. One of the things that we find as well is the consumers that are now mobilizing like never before to call on companies to be accountable are the same people who work for you as well. Just because they work for the company doesn't mean they don't care. And some of the most powerful advocacy we've seen is through the consumer base, the employee base of companies. And so one of my favorite examples is a young girl, Mia, who started a petition asking Jamba Juice, a company she loves with the drink she enjoys all the time. She found out that Jamba Juice throws away hundreds of millions of styrofoam cups a year. And she had an 8th grade class in which she found out about this garbage patch in the Pacific and how detrimental this was to the environment. And she starts an innocent petition asking Jamba Juice to create and to use compostable cups. And she gets almost 100,000 people to join. And after a few weeks of campaigning and massive media exposure, Jamba Juice announces they're going to go 100% compostable cups. What was interesting about this is because the impact wasn't exclusively Mia and the 100,000 people that took action. It was actually the employees within Jamba Juice who themselves were signing the petition, talking about it, and advocated it for it themselves. In fact, there had been people already within Jamba Juice who wanted them to do the right thing. In the sustainability department, they've suggested this in the past. But there wasn't the impetus. There wasn't the trigger effect. And the executive team and the organization didn't feel the obligation to do this. But when you have this massive outpouring of support externally demonstrating consumer demand, and then it really seeps internally to disrupt your own organization, that's where it's incredibly powerful. And this is going to accelerate significantly. We see this not just in consumer products, but one of the most amazing examples that happened early on in the site was seeing employees call on their own companies for better benefits and for more respect. And this is an example that was really interesting around Thanksgiving, where Target announces only a couple months before Thanksgiving that they're going to change the hours of their workers. That workers can no longer spend Thanksgiving with their families. They're going to open up the store so that anyone can buy, not just on Black Friday, but Thanksgiving itself. And so one of their workers starts a petition calling on them to change that policy. It gets more than 100,000 people to join, and it spawns this entire mass movement across the country around Target employees and consumers calling on Target to do the right thing, and then inspires more petitions around Best Buy, around Walmart, and all these other big box retailers. And right now, what's happened is not a direct transformation. It is changing the incentives of Target and of all these other companies that are in now discussions with employees, recognizing that employees now have this incredible inside-outside voice that they can leverage, that gives them newfound power, that gives them a sense of an ability in the absence of unions that actually can dynamically be able to organize together and represent their own voice. And this is only just beginning. And so you can shudder at it or you can fear it, but you have to face it. And this is the kind of thing that we talk to companies about embracing because they now recognize they are on equal footing to their own employees. And for us, we see this as the future of business. We think this is going to be the biggest and most important transformation is not just technology, but the way that businesses are run, the way that people every single day think of and conceive of what's possible with their own institution organization. Now, the question people have oftentimes when we talk to them is, well, does this mean that we just take the mental model that we had before that Milton Friedman gave us in 1970, which is the sole purpose of an organization is to maximize profits? And then in the situations in which it means it's in our economic self-interest to pretend as if we don't just care about economics, we should actually respect our employees and respect our consumers insofar as people are watching. Right? I think that's the mental model that some people still have, but that is a schizophrenic and unsustainable model. Right? The businesses that will be most successful recognize this inevitability. And instead of saying, well, I'm going to try to, at the margins, act better because it's now in my financial self-interest, it is going to be embracing a transformation in the way they see their own business and embracing a sense of not just shareholder value, but stakeholder perspective in the communities around you, in the environment that you impact, and in the employees that you staff. And what we see right now is one of the most powerful movements that we're excited about is this, the B Corp movement. And so there's this idea now that is supported by institutions. The B Corp movement is started in 2006 by a nonprofit called B Lab, a number of entrepreneurs who had sold their company. It's called And One. It's a basketball apparel company for any of you who might remember, and they found that they weren't able to preserve the mission of their company and the way they respected their employees and sourced their materials when they sold their company. And they felt like the baby they had born, the intense fight that they had had, the success they had was actually undermined at the final point where they were successful because they sold the company and they lost the control over the mission. And so this idea of transforming the way we see business in a stakeholder model. And so what B Corp allows you to do is to supplement your C corporation, your traditional for-profit corporation, with a new model of articulating a specific mission, of explicitly saying that you as an institution care about making impact. You see yourself as a business as a vessel for social change, and you're willing to be transparent and measured against it, against the way you treat your employees and empower them, the impact the environment, and influence the communities around yourself. And this, we think, is going to be a huge, huge movement. And I think more than anyone, more than any institution, technology companies are best positioned to embrace this model. And it's happening now. Etsy has done this. Warby Parker has embraced it. We have become a B corporation as well. I think the reason why technology companies in particular have best position to be able to embrace this new movement of using business for social good is twofold. One is we actually, more than any company, I think, are subject to these two huge undercurrents. First, empowered consumers. Technology companies, especially platforms like Change.org, like Etsy, like Facebook and Twitter, these are places that are, the value of these places are predicated on a community of people that are adding value to the platform, that themselves are contributing. And because of that, trust with community is such an essential component of what you do. If you're not responsive to users, if you don't think you're in service of them and a broader mission and narrative, not just short-term maximization of profits, you're not going to build the company you want. And the second is empowered employees. There are no more empowered employees, I think, than those in the technology sector. And no more employees that are treated, I think, in many ways better by the companies they work for. And this was started in many ways, I think, by Google. Google explicitly saying, and it seems in superficial ways of spending lots of money on perks and benefits, but thinking of employees as deep partners and as core crucial assets in the organization, that are partners for the long term and not just people to be exploited in the short term. And because of this increasing number of high-performing human capital and the ease, fluidity with which people can move jobs in Silicon Valley or across the world in technology, because of that ease and that frictionless ability, because the passion increasingly people have of getting involved in technology for social change, technology business uniquely among others have the incentive, I think, to move forward with the B Corporation model. Now, one of the impediments historically for companies in the tech space thinking about this has been investor knowledge. It's been, it's already difficult to raise money. Is this going to be plausible and fundable? You already see this happening now. NEA has backed companies that have done this. DFJ has backed companies. Union Square Ventures has backed B Corporation companies, including Etsy. In fact, Fred Wilson has explicitly said, and sort of outright support of B Corporations, how essential this can be for a number of companies in the tech space in building trust and having a new vision of the possibilities of business. And the reality is, for most founders, if not all, and I hope almost all, right, while money is a component of what you do and a component of the motivation, right, most founders think they're going to be in service of change in the world in some way. And what we want is a tax structure, at least embracing a practice that is consistent with your message, that is consistent with the desires of your business and not just maximizing profits in the short term. And so we are excited about this and more than happy to talk to any organizations that are also passionate about B Corporation, about thinking of themselves in this different type of light. And the last thing that we talk about a lot in the company is the end of trade-offs. Right? So what does the future of the world look like when all of this happens, when all of this is possible? Right? If you are in a business in which you think you're making trade-offs on a regular basis between purpose and profits, I think you're running your business the wrong way. Right? You shouldn't be working for those companies. Every company has the opportunity to participate and to be contributing to social value. Now, it may not be in the products or the services you provide. It's not that I think every business is going to be a charitable enterprise that is trying to solve the biggest problems of our time, although I like those businesses as well. But it's not just what you do, it is how you do it. We all have control as founders and as executives and as staff over how the businesses that we participate in are run, how we treat our employees through benefits, through respecting things like family parent leave, by things like respecting the environment, the impact that we have on the environment, things like impacting the supply chain or people that work at our companies or for us in back rooms working minimum wage when we advocate for a living wage, ask the government to pass this, but don't do it ourselves as employers. And I think that every company has the capacity to do that, to transform the way they run their business. And if we do that, whether you are running a social gaming company or a discount coupon company or a geolocation company or a direct social impact company, every one of those institutions has the capacity to change the way they do business, the way they treat their staff, the way they respect the environment and the community around them. And if you do that, we make that transformation, you truly change the trajectory of humanity because business is immensely powerful, far more than most people like, but if it's in service of social impact, then it is good for everyone. And we in the technology sector talk a lot about how we are disrupting and transforming business. I think that if there's any one thing that I could see in the next decades ahead, that if we did as a technology sector to truly transform business, it's not just in the technology disruption we enable, but the way we change the way we run our businesses, and that is something we are all responsible for. And so with that, I want to close and open the floor to questions, because there may be some from other founders who are considering the possibility of running social change companies within their current structure. And so there is going to be a microphone, I think, in the back here, probably, if you want to line up. And I'll say one other thing in the meantime, which is you have seen over the past decade in particular a lot of startup CEOs, technology CEOs, like Larry Page and Sergey Brin, like Zuck more recently at Facebook, embracing sort of this model. Right? They've asked for what they call founder shares. They want to be able to control their own companies by having a modified dual-class share structure so that they don't have to be subject to the whims of short-term financial self-interest. Zuck wrote this letter to shareholders before Facebook went public, talking about how they don't just make product to make money, they make money to make product. And I believe that is a passionate belief of that company, Facebook, and truly Google as well. However, there is a difference between making a forceful statement as a CEO in a unique kind of force structure and having a deeply embedded something in your tax structure or as a commitment you've made that is public and that is transparent and that you hold yourself accountable to. Because you are what you measure, and if you don't explicitly measure these things, you're not going to motivate your entire staff and call on your board on a regular basis to ensure itself is accountable to being good and not just relying on the founder who through founder share is trying to control a long-term vision. Question.
Thanks for the interesting talk. A question from Europe. Where I come from, a lot of the problems that you talked about, like worker rights and environmental problems and so on, are regulated by law. And you seem to suggest that this isn't necessary if people just resolve to being good. Is that preferable from your point of view, or have you just given up hope towards your legislature?
Yeah, so I think there will be both. I think the idea that somehow we as business leaders who have ethics and standards and are voters ourselves should be exploiting our workers, and then only insofar as regulatory environment prevents us from doing so should we actually respect them, is an absurdity. The idea that we literally all support this idea, many people, of a living wage, and then don't actually wait for the government to legislate and require us legally to do it seems crazy and inconsistent. And so it's not that we don't need regulations, it's that the regulatory environment is an actual relatively difficult thing to do in an effective manner on a real-time basis for all companies. So what I would love is an efficient, effective, reasonable regulatory sector. But I want businesses to recognize that it is in their interest, if they want to build the business of the future, to build it in a way that respects and doesn't actually require the government to pedantically tell them what to do that they should do themselves. It doesn't mean the government should still exist. There will be outliers and people that will not respect workers' rights, and that's necessary. But I think it's an incredibly powerful thing to do, to preempt it, to embrace it, and to actually do it out of your own free will as a company.
Good afternoon. Great speech. So how does this impact a fairly massive industry in the U.S. like the electricity industry that's fighting fairly vigorously and aggressively against something like net metering? Just really sort of disrupts their entire business model, which is pretty much adheres to the Milton Friedman model. So I'd love your 2 cents on that.
So part of the reason that we talk about how tech companies have a unique ability to embrace this model is in part because tech companies generally, at least young companies now, are also contributing disproportionately to social good by virtue of just providing their product. And it's also easier to embed a social mission in your organization the earlier on it starts. Once you've deeply embedded in your business model something that is actually antithetical to the public interest, and it is already priced into your stock price, and expectations are massive, it is much more difficult. It is not impossible, but much more difficult. But if you look at, right now, energy companies, Al Gore has started an investment fund called Generations with David Blood from Goldman Sachs. And their thesis is, for energy companies, what they don't recognize is if you look long-term enough, it is inevitable, let's say oil companies in particular, it's inevitable that they're going to get regulated, that coal is going to have, or rather, that carbon is going to have a tax. And right now, they're not sufficiently incorporating that eventuality into their price structure, into their future plans and R&D. And that the best strategy of energy companies is actually spending a huge amount of money on innovation for clean tech. And if you look long enough for those companies, there is actually a confluence between purpose and profits, between better business practices and what's better for the environment. Now, it doesn't look like it all the time. It doesn't mean it's going to look pretty in the short term. But I do definitely think it's a case that companies that invest significantly in the future businesses they will be in, because the inevitability of some degree of regulation, especially in energy, are the ones that will succeed in the future.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. You've discussed the importance of adding social good to the value chain for new businesses. Can you give us some tips for how we can actually implement these in the businesses we currently run without forming a new B Corp?
Yeah. So a couple things on B Corp. One is, even if you're an existing C corporation, which is almost every startup would be incorporated in Delaware if they're in the US. Just because of the nature of tax law in Delaware, it's not just like tax avoidance, it's actually ease with which you can incorporate. you can actually add B Corporation onto your C Corp. It's just a public commitment you're making. It's credentialing process. It's certification that anybody can do, even with your existing investors. Now there is even a step further you can take, which is just enabled recently, which is benefit corporation legislation. It's somewhat further. It was passed in Delaware in August that allows you illegally to change your incorporation letters to build not just as a commitment of the company, but legal requirement that the company's directors consider stakeholders and not just shareholders. So I might address that if anybody has questions about that later. But there's a more difficult, higher bar movement right now for legislative change or kind of legal incorporation change for the company. But short of that, any business can actually embody and embrace B Corp certification. Etsy did it after about, I think, probably 4, 5, 6 years of being in business. And here I'll walk through some of the examples of the kind of impact that might have on your business. So Etsy found out, they said, look, well, what we really care about is how do we make sure that what we're doing as a company, not just in the product we provide, but how we run our company, is advancing good in the world we want to see. And they looked across their dev floor, and they didn't see a lot of women. And it's not new to tech companies to not see a lot of women, but it's also not new to not think it's a core mission of the company to worry about such an issue. Well, Etsy, in embracing the B Corporation mentality, said, we think that's not good for the world. And so what they did is help fund a program in New York to get training, and more sort of promotion for girls coding, young women coding. And what ended up happening is they dramatically increased the number of female engineers they had in the company. They also realized, well, look, we've never looked at the carbon footprint we have as a company. We've never looked at whether, how much we recycle, where we source items from, and whatnot. And so they also looked at that because they took this B Corporation mentality and were willing to explicitly support it and measure themselves against it. Also led to significant changes. And for us, we think about this a lot around employee work as well. I mean, one of the things that I mentioned earlier that I think is just ridiculous, the idea that in the United States, and Europeans don't have this problem, but in the US, I mean, the common amount of leave for parental leave for dads is 2 weeks, which is ridiculous. Like, it's offensive. It's just terrible for everybody. It's bad for the family. It's bad for the relationship. It's bad certainly for the stay-at-home mom or partner. It's really bad for the economy in the long term. And so the idea of actually looking at yourself as an institution, trying to add value to the lives of your staff, I think would necessitate a much different perspective on that. If you're not giving 6 weeks or more, then you're doing, I think, something wrong. And so that's, I think, what's exciting about it, is saying, I run my business now, but if I take this broader perspective, not just shareholders, but stakeholders, what are the other things I might do as a business leader to improve my business? And I think that's going to improve your business in many ways. Yes?
I'm just curious about whether or not the crowd ever becomes a mob, and whether you've had campaigns that have embarrassed you and your organization.
Yeah, we oftentimes say, one person's mob is another person's movement. So it's at the eyes of the beholder. I think that because of the transparency that's happened online, a lot of people are concerned, is this going to be mob mentality with misinformation and people, are propagating lies and falsehoods and whatnot? I think the irony is, because of radical transparency, you also have transparency around the campaigns that people are joining. And so if somebody has started or something is spreading a falsehood, you get people on Twitter in particular, but in blogs as well, that are calling that out and that actually reduce the chance that that campaign is going to go viral. And so the crowd in many cases self-regulates in almost every situation. So we rarely see cases that we are truly embarrassed by campaigns. Again, we don't take a stance on them in particular. We're truly a platform empowering others and others' voices. But what you find is much more inspiration and constructive participation than other people might expect. So with that, we're going to close. And my last comment would just be, if you have any inclination whatsoever, if you've read this quote from Milton Friedman, this idea that the sole purpose of a company is to maximize profits, and you think it, as I do, is ridiculous and bad for the world, and you run a business or have material influence over the business, which is almost anyone who works at a business, then I think you are obligated to deeply think about the kind of business that you want to be running and ask yourself why it's not something more like a B Corporation. It is absolutely possible to do. Almost 1,000 companies around the world have done it. And you are either going to do it now and be at the leading edge and proud of yourself, or the inevitability is that every company is going to have to do something like this in the future because they will lose out in the wars in customers, the war for your brand, and the war for talent. Thank you very much.